Okay, good morning. It is 10 a.m., so I'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to Filling in the Family Tree, Kentucky's Birth and Death Records. I am going to go ahead and move it over to the main presentation, so you're going to see your screen change up here a little bit. If you do have trouble hearing me, just let me know. I tend to be a soft speaker, so I am trying to get as close to the mic here as I can so you can hear me. And just want to introduce myself. My name is Debbie Hibbard, and I'm currently the Circulation and Outreach Librarian here at KDLA. Until recently, though, I was a reference librarian, and I worked in the Archives Research Room for the last 2 years. I'd also like to introduce Wynn. Wynn is our reference librarian. She is currently in the Archives Research Room, and she's going to be manning our chat room today. So if you have any technical or sound issues, just be sure to chat those in to Wynn, and she'll do some troubleshooting. Also, if you have any comments or questions throughout, be sure to chat those in as well, and we will try to answer your questions. If we can't answer them here, then I will email you, get back to you in email later. And this webinar is being recorded, just so you know. It is going to be placed on our archive training sessions page, but your names are going to be concealed for your privacy. And finally, at the end, we'll have a little housekeeping to do, but just wanted to let you know there is going to be a PDF of the presentation available for download, as well as a survey of the webinar. All right. So when you're talking about birth and death records in Kentucky, what is available really depends on the time period. So I'm going to be looking at 3 crucial time periods this morning. The first is prior to 1852. The next time period is from 1852 to 1910, and then from 1911 to present. Okay, prior to 1852. So, based on the many calls that I've gotten in the Archives Research Room on this subject, I can tell you that it really comes as a great surprise to many that there are no official birth or death records before 1852 in Kentucky. I've had many a person call, so they had tried to find a birth record. They're looking for one in 1820 or, some other time before 1852. Unfortunately, there was no state or local government entity that kept birth or death records before 1852 in Kentucky. There could be several possible reasons for that. I mean, when you think about it, especially in the early 1800s, Kentucky was still very much a wilderness. People were settling in the area, had other things on their mind besides keeping this information. A lot of people were born and died at home, certainly up until the 20th century in Kentucky, and that makes it a little more challenging to find and keep this kind of information and register it. And then it was also considered the domain of the church in many instances. People kept these types of records in their family Bibles. They would have baptism or christening records sometimes. At a church, that church is where, a person would be buried, and those types of church records, cemetery records, would be the documentation for a person's death. So, just nothing official, though, nothing official on births or deaths before 1852. So, what do you do when you don't have these official government records? What can you use instead? Well, if you're really lucky, you'll have a family Bible that's come down to you through the family, or maybe a distant cousin has access to that. And some places that you can find family Bibles, if you don't happen to have that in your attic, FamilySearch.org wiki, and I'm going to show you this in a minute. We'll go into some of these resources in a little more detail here in a little bit. But they have a fabulous wiki on the subject of family Bibles, and they have a lot of different resources that you can look at. Certainly Daughters of the American Revolution has a lot of information on family Bibles. There are online Bible indexes. There's a Kentucky Bible Archives. So FamilySearch.org is a great source of information on that. Historical societies. Here in Kentucky, we have two main historical societies, the Kentucky Historical Society and the Filson Historical Society, which is located in Louisville. And then there are a number of counties that have local county historical societies, so those can be great sources of information. Sometimes families have donated the family Bible to one of these historical societies for the record. You also have church records. Unfortunately, many churches have been lost to time, and those records are lost, but there are some still out there. For Protestant churches, the Kentucky Historical Society can be a very good source for church records, and again, those county historical societies. For Catholic churches, you might have better luck because those records tend to have been kept more consistently. And there are several diocese archives in Kentucky. Covington has one, Lexington, Louisville, and Owensboro. So if you have an ancestor or your patron has an ancestor of the Catholic faith, then those archives can be helpful. And as far as the Jewish faith is concerned, and there were Jewish settlers here in Kentucky, of course, the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati is a great source of information. And then there's the U.S. Federal Census. In 1850 and the subsequent census years, you get ages for people. And so that can help to kind of determine a birth year. Okay, so this is that wiki I was talking about on FamilySearch.org. They have a wealth of information on Kentucky family Bibles. You see the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. It has an index that has over 40,000 digitized family Bibles. There is an indexed early Bible records there. We have the Kentucky Bible Archives on Kentucky Gen Web. So I really encourage you to go to that wiki and look there for Bible records. And they have many different resources listed. The Kentucky Historical Society has a research library, the Martin F. Schmidt Research Library, and just a little bit of information, kind of the difference between the Kentucky Historical Society and the state archives. At the state archives, we have local and state government records only. So we don't keep family surname files. We don't have anything that would be considered private papers, family Bibles, cemetery records, or church records. We don't keep that kind of information. It's only state and local government records that we have. We have county records in the form of microfilm that covers all 120 counties. We have all the circuit criminal, most of, I should say, the circuit civil and criminal court cases. So if a genealogist has a divorce or a contested will or something of that nature, then we might have that court record. And we also have state agency records, and we have governor's papers. So those are the types of records we have here. The microfilm is what gets used the most in terms of genealogy. And those are whatever you're going to find in the county clerk's office. That's microfilm of county clerk records, wills, deeds, tax lists, marriages, and so on. We also have some county histories in the state library, so you can find that type of information. But at the Kentucky Historical Society, that's where you're going to find your church records, your family papers, your published and unpublished genealogy, surname files, and that can be really helpful when you're looking for those pre-1852 births and deaths. Now they do charge you $6 to get in. That's part of general admission to the museum as well, unless you're a member of the Kentucky Historical Society, and then that's all included in your membership fee. Just a little information about the Kentucky Historical Society. They're kind of a quasi-government agency. They actually started as a private agency in 1838. They became kind of dormant for a while, and then they were revived in 1896, and then finally secured funding from the General Assembly in 1906, which gave them state agency status to some degree. But they're also kind of a private entity as well, because you can get a membership there. They have lots of genealogy learning opportunities for your patrons, so I would definitely give them information about the Historical Society. They have a DNA interest group book club that meets for 9 months and discusses various books written on the use of DNA and genealogy research. They have the Genealogy Tea and Sympathy group discussions that meet once a month. As a matter of fact, they've got one coming up this Saturday. They have a lot of different workshops. There's a Getting Started with Genealogy workshop. So they have a lot of programming. We do the Kentucky Archives Institute, which is about once a year, but they do monthly programming for genealogists. And sometimes when we've had out-of-state people come in to do research on genealogy, they're kind of confused about the separation between the state archives and the Historical Society, because in a lot of states they're combined, they're together. But it's just the way that archives kind of developed in Kentucky is a little bit different. And it really got started with the Historical Society. Okay. There's also the Filson Historical Society, and I tend to I'll give people information on the Kentucky Historical Society, but I would also tend, if they were in the Louisville area, if their ancestor was from that area, give them information on the Filson Historical Society as well. And that's a great resource for Louisville area records. Filson was founded on May the 15th, 1884 by 10 Louisvillians with a common love of history. They have 2.1 million documents, 50,000 books, 10,000 museum items, and 75 years of digitized searchable issues of the Filson Club History Quarterly, which is like the Register for the Kentucky Historical Society. And those publications have a lot of different genealogy information in them. They've got 400 plus portraits, lots of historic photographs and prints of Louisville and the Ohio Valley. And they do a lot of lectures and scholarly conferences and public programs as well. So that's definitely I think if someone's got family from the Louisville area, that's a great place to go do research too. And then don't forget your local historical society. This is the Woodford County Historical Society's website. I include this because I live in Woodford County. They are a very active collector of local records and a great resource for the county. Notice they have those church records for many of the local churches going back as early as 1801. So that's just a fantastic source of information. Not every county has a specific historical society. Sometimes you can find a genealogy and local history room at your public library. I grew up in Boyd County, and they have a wonderful room, a genealogy room that covers not just Boyd, but also surrounding counties. Certainly Lexington Public Library has the Kentucky room, which has a lot of the old Kentucky, Lexington area newspapers on microfilm, and they have also some genealogy records there. The Louisville Free Public Library, I believe, also has a genealogy and history room. So does anyone else here have a room that's specifically devoted to history and genealogy? Any of the other libraries here? Looks like several people are typing. Adair County, great. Yeah, those can be a fantastic source of information. Sometimes the local library is really the kind of basically the historical society for the county. You have a new Kentucky history room at Louisville? Okay, open last October. Fantastic. So do your libraries have surname files and things of that nature? Do you keep genealogies? People are able to contribute their genealogies to the room? Yes, okay. Very good. Okay. Yeah, so certainly the public library. I always tell people, check for a historical society, but also check the public library in the county because, those are great sources of information. Um, okay. And certainly would have county histories and things of that nature. Sometimes county histories, my dad's family's from Johnson County, and we have a county history here that has a complete genealogy of some of his family. And so you'll never know when you're going to find that information. It just pays to dig around. Okay. These are the websites for the Archive of the Catholic Archdiocese in Louisville, and also for those with Jewish ancestry, the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So sometimes I have had people tell me that sometimes those Catholic archives, forget which one, I think it might have been Covington, are sometimes difficult to get a hold of. Generally, they have very limited hours when they answer phone calls and take questions from the public. So be sure, they usually have that on the website, what their hours are and so forth. You see there is the Archdiocese of Louisville. And they do have a center there on South Shelby Street, looks like, in Louisville, where you can go. And they have an archdiocesan history there as well, historian, it looks like, who can help you access records. And you can just Google, Archdiocese or Diocese of Covington or Archdiocese of Louisville to get the URL for those sites. Also, the American Jewish Archives there in Cincinnati. There were a number of Jewish settlers actually in Kentucky, beginning as early as the beginning of the 19th century. If you're from the Lexington area, Benjamin Gratz, of Gratz Park fame, was an early Jewish settler in Lexington, settled in about 1819. He came from a famous Philadelphia family. And then certainly in the northern Kentucky area, several Jewish communities. So the American Jewish Archives has an extensive collection of resources and a lot of genealogy material there. Okay. And then the census. Of course, you don't get ages for individuals until 1850. Before 1850, you get the head of the household, and there will be they'll have the number of males over 16, the number of females over a certain age, the number of slaves in a household, and so on. In 1850, they start giving you ages. So you see there. And so you can guesstimate the birth year of that person. Certainly look and see what month that the census was taken to get kind of an idea. And then you also have, in 1850, free African Americans are listed. There is a slave census, but that only tells you the age and sex of the person. You don't get names with that. There's also a slave census in 1860. And then in 1900, that's the only census that gives you a month and year. All other censuses just give you the age of the person after 1850. So, but that's kind of a way to kind of guess what year they were born. At least that gives you some idea. Now, with deaths, you have more possibilities for pinning down a death date. So in addition to those family Bibles and those church records, you can look for cemetery and funeral home records. So the Historical Society has the WPA, in the 1930s, the WPA went and did cemetery surveys throughout the state. So a lot of those small local cemeteries, you'll find that survey at the Kentucky Historical Society. Also, there's a lot of information on findagrave.com. I'm sure you've had patrons get on that website. It's a very common website. Find a Grave is also incorporated in the Ancestry.com website. You also have those local historical societies and funeral homes. Now, Kentucky Historical Society also has I believe, a small collection of funeral home records that you can check. Another thing about the Historical Society's church records is that they do have them divided up by county. So a person can actually request, can you have a search of the different church records in a particular county? So that can kind of narrow things down if you know where the person was living. Um, And then obituaries and death notices. Sometimes can be found for individuals. They can be harder to find before about the mid 1800s. Generally, they're just a line that says so and so died. It's just really more of a death notice. Um, and before the Civil War, you didn't get more than a line usually, unless the person was someone with some social status, and then it might tell a little bit more about them. But for the average person, you may not get anything, or you might just have a death notice. Obituaries became more common during and after the Civil War, and the detailed obituaries that we find today, which really kind of tells a person's story to some extent, with this name's surviving family and so on, those didn't really become common until the latter part of the 20th century. So obituaries could sometimes be helpful, but especially during those pre-1852 years, that can, be a little more challenging. UK has the largest collection of newspapers on microfilm from across the state, and they have a database that you can search for those titles. Certainly, of course, public libraries also have usually their local paper on microfilm. And then the Library of Congress has the Chronicling America site that has, you can find a directory of digitized newspapers for Kentucky. You can also find just a directory of newspapers so that you can get the title. And then tax lists, we'll talk about that a little more in depth. Those can be helpful in determining a possible year of death. And wills. And you can find these at FamilySearch.org in some instances. We have them on microfilm, and certainly the county clerk's offices has those wills and estate settlements and so on. They tend to keep the originals. Okay, so this is UK's microfilm holdings database page, and you can browse by county and city to see if they have a newspaper in the area and time period you're looking for. UK does lend their newspaper microfilm to any public library throughout the state, so if you have a patron who's wanting an obituary, you can request an interlibrary loan for that microfilm from UK. The earliest newspaper in Kentucky is the Kentucky Gazette that began publishing in 1787. And Lexington Public Library actually used to have the very first original issue of that. Some of the historic Kentucky newspapers can be found digitized in the Kentucky Digital Library. They recently changed their website, and now I cannot find the newspapers. So you might have to dig around on that website a little bit, but all of the Kentucky Gazette, for example, was digitized, and that covered most of central Kentucky. So you could find some of those death notices and so on in that. Newspapers.com is a resource also for some digitized historic newspapers. If your library happens to have a subscription to that, that is of course a subscription service that's available through Ancestry. We do not have newspapers.com here, unfortunately. And in addition, the Library of Congress has that site Chronicling America, Historic American Newspapers, and that has a newspaper directory from 1690 to the present. So that's really good. Sometimes I would go there to help identify the title of the newspaper, and then I'd go to this UK microfilm holdings database to see what we had in terms of what years were survived and were microfilmed. Again, public libraries are a great source of information. Sometimes you can find obituary indexes on a public library's website. I want to shout out to Davis County Public Library. They have a terrific obituary index that I have used numerous times to help patrons find obituaries. And it covers not just Davis County, but the whole surrounding counties in the Owensboro area. Also, don't have a website of it, but the Kenton County Public Library has an index for Northern Kentucky newspapers, and the Lexington Public Library has a local history index to the Herald Leader, and some of the other early Lexington area newspapers. Sometimes difficult to find obituaries in those indexes, but certainly worth a shot. Okay, tax lists. Tax lists are good for helping you to pinpoint what year an individual might have passed away, usually a male. For example, if you have an ancestor who shows on the 1840 census, but they're no longer on the census in 1850, there's a good chance that person has passed away during that decade, and the tax list can be used to pinpoint what year. So you start with the 1840 tax list for that county, and then you follow that tax list until the person falls off of it, or you see the estate paying taxes on the for the individual. When they fall off the tax list, again, that's a good chance that that person has passed away. Sometimes you will get lucky and see where the estate is paying the taxes, or the widow. You can then look for a will or an estate settlement or maybe an obituary to get the actual date of death, or kind of within a month and a year at least that the death occurred. So this is an example of a tax list from Lawrence County in 1823. Tax laws in the earliest years of Kentucky's statehood stipulated that tax commissioners for each district take a list of every free male over the age of 21 who was subject to a poll tax. So they didn't necessarily have to own land. It's just any man over the age of 21 is going to show up on the tax list. And you can bet there's a tax list for pretty much every year. These are one of the consistent records that you find here in Kentucky, where you can find a record for just about every year. They made sure that the taxes were paid. So that's one thing that you will find in those early years of Kentucky statehood. So until 1828, the tax reports, which you sometimes will hear the term tithables list, these were completed during required military musters. And then after 1828, a tax commissioner was required to visit each residence of each citizen to obtain the list. So this is the person who visited every residence in the county, and so that's why these are such fantastic sources of information. Women and free African Americans only appear on tax lists if they owned land. And when a man died, again, his widow usually appears until the estate is settled or she remarries. So generally not going to find, this is, finding a death date for a woman is a lot more challenging. Finding a death date for African Americans, a lot more challenging, obviously. But tax lists can be a great source of information for your male ancestors. And this is a will. This is Jeremiah Burns's will from 1824 in Lawrence County, of course. Once you find that the person has fallen off the tax list, you can look for a will or an estate settlement. Original will books and estate settlement books are generally kept in the county at the county clerk's office. We have microfilm copies. We are required here at KDLA by state law to keep a security microfilm copy of everything in the county clerk's office in case something happens to the county clerk's office. That way those records are saved. But the tax lists, we have the originals of those. We have all the auditor's office files. So sometimes a person the microfilm is just not a good copy for whatever reason, and it's very difficult to read. We do have the original here, and we have brought those down for individuals before. One thing that I want to mention about those tax lists and wills is that a lot of those county records are also digitized on FamilySearch.org. In the 50s and 60s, the LDS Church came through and filmed a lot of records from county clerk's offices. And so since the film is theirs, they have digitized these records. So FamilySearch.org is a really good place to go. It's a free website, does not require a subscription. And I send people there all the time to look for marriages, these tax lists, the wills, and so forth. Now, not everything is digitized. So in some instances, people will need to come to us or go to the county clerk's office to get the record. But it's a really good source of information. Okay, so that finishes prior to 1852, which is the most challenging time period to find any type of birth or death information in Kentucky. Does anybody have any questions right now before we move on? Yeah, any questions? Okay, let's move on to 1852 to 1910. Even though we don't have any records before 1852, we were the first state west of the Alleghenies to require registration of births and deaths. That started in 1852 with the Sutton Law. One thing about these records from 1852 to 1910, they were irregularly kept. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But in 1852, the Sutton Law was passed, and that required, this was our very first vital statistics law in Kentucky. It was not popular, and compliance was very inconsistent. The reason that it was passed was for physicians to kind of track cholera epidemic. They wanted to know what people were dying of and, how many people were being born in the state. And so that was really how that got started. It was kind of an impetus by physicians in the state to start keeping these kinds of records. Tax assessors were given the job of collecting the registers because they were the ones who went around every year and visited every residence in the county. They did not like the extra work, and so many times they didn't see the value of keeping the information. There are lots of problems with these records. Sometimes dates are inaccurate. People are left out. People have even found that the list will include events that actually happened in another county. So a person was born in another county, but they're living in, say, Boyd County, and at the time that the tax assessor comes around, so they weren't really born in Boyd County, but they're listed as having been there. You will find lots of inaccuracies in these records. Also, they weren't kept for every year between 1852 and 1910. When the Civil War began, reporting became non-existent for the most part, and then the law was repealed in 1862. And you don't find another vital statistics law being passed in the state until 1874. The second law required birth and death records be sent to the state auditor. Again, it was poorly administered. The results were very irregular. Many counties didn't participate or they dropped the program after a few years. And that law was repealed in 1878. And then from the 1890s to 1910, some scattered counties did keep records, just kept records on their own. But there is definitely not, again, any kind of consistency to those records. And there were 4 Kentucky cities that did keep birth and death records separate from the county registers. That was Covington, Lexington, Louisville, and Newport. So sometimes you can find an ancestor who lived outside these cities and maybe even lived in another county. You would find hospitals in these, these are more urban areas, and you would find a hospital here, and people would come to the hospital for their medical needs, and they might die in the hospital. So sometimes you will find records in these city registers, but generally, you're going to start with your county, and chances are good that you may not find any kind of birth or death record at all. I just want to mention this resource too. This is kind of what I consider the Bible of Kentucky genealogy. It has a lot of information on various vital stats laws, just a lot of information on genealogy in general in Kentucky. Some of the information is it hasn't been updated. So a lot of the information on where things are, for example, what we have here in the state archives, can be outdated. But the core information about the history of the records and what records are available in Kentucky and how do you find a naturalization, what record do you go to for that? That information is a gold mine for genealogists. So definitely want to put that out there as a resource. I'm sure you probably have this book in your library. Okay, so we do have a record of the birth and death, the years that birth and death records were kept for each county on our website. So you're going to want to go to our website to see what year births and deaths were kept for each county. And to do that, you go to kdla.ky.gov, and under the Researchers tab, look at the How to Request Records from the Archives link. And then when you're on that page, we have that here. It is just click here for a list of birth records 1852 to 1910 by county or by city. And here's that listing. It does have roll numbers for the microfilm that you can find these records on. Completely ignore the marriage records. They also kept registers of marriages. These tax assessors did. Again, those are real inconsistent. Generally speaking, the county clerks kept that marriage information, and those usually go back to the formation of the county. So marriage records you can almost usually find a marriage record for a person in Kentucky. Those records were kept pretty consistently. So just ignore those years. They are included on the microfilm roll. But you see, for example, Adair County kept birth records from 1852 to 1859. They did keep them in 1861 until the Civil War really got started here in Kentucky. They kept them from 1874 to 76, again in 1878, and then 1893 to 94, 1903 to 1904, and so on. You see there. Then the death records, looks like they actually kept deaths for a little bit shorter period of time for those 1850 years. But really, Adair County, that's a really good job. They kept them for a lot more years than many other counties did. You see Anderson County down there kept them for very few years. So really depended on the county. And this is the microfilm year rolls that are available for the cities. So Louisville, Lexington, and so on. And you see that they kept separate registers in Louisville. A lot of these cover those 1890 and up years. So, okay. And what kind of information are you going to find on one of those early birth registers? They have the date of birth. They'll have the name of the person. The sex, the condition of the baby. Usually you don't see anything in that column. The place of birth. They'll have the name of the father or owner of the child in the case of an enslaved child. They'll have the maiden name of the mother, and then it indicates the color of the child. And mulatto was, I guess that's a biracial category. And then they have residence of parent and remarks, and you generally won't see anything in remarks unless there's something really unusual. And here is an 1852 or 1853 birth record, and that's the register. It's just a register. No certificates were issued at that time, and they're generally in chronological order. Not always strict chronological order, though. And this is on Family Search. This is one that's found on Family Search. Now, after emancipation in the 1903 birth record, for example, you can find the date of birth, name, sex. They will say whether the child was born alive or dead. It gives the place of birth, name of father, maiden name of mother. They still indicate the color of the child at that point. You get the birthplace of the father and the birthplace of the mother, and residence and remarks. And this is an example of the register from 1903, also found on Family Search. That's for Franklin County. You will not see, sometimes it's surprising, you'll see just very few names, and so obviously they just really didn't keep a record of every person in the county that was born for that year. Now, the delayed birth certificate. So these were issued by the Office of Vital Statistics. This is a birth certificate that is created after the fact, in some instances long after the birth occurred. And an applicant had to provide certain pieces of information to support the date of birth. Those could be affidavits from individuals who attended the birth, federal and school census records, family Bible entries. You'll see that listed on the delayed birth certificate, what was used to support the date of birth. We have seen birth years as early as the 1850s. Generally, people would apply for a delayed birth certificate when Social Security came into being in the 1930s, about 1935. So you had to have, in order to get a Social Security number, you had to have a birth record. So a lot of Kentuckians who were born, particularly in the latter part of the 1800s, would go in and get a delayed birth certificate. And so you can find those. The only place you can find those is at the Office of Vital Statistics. You can contact us for assistance to determine if there might be a delayed birth certificate, or the Office of Vital Statistics. Now, one thing to keep in mind when contacting Vital Stats is that they're very much engaged in the here and now. So they generally, and I believe it's a state law actually, they have to have an application before they'll search for any kind of birth record. So that includes delayed birth certificates. And when you have someone contact, if a patron contacts Vital Stats for a birth certificate, you want to make sure they emphasize it's a little delayed birth record that they are looking for, because that is a completely separate collection from the other birth records. And they may not be as, they may not think as readily about that being a possibility for someone that was born before 1911, when the Office of Vital Statistics was open. So that's just something to consider. Make sure that when they contact Vital Stats that they really emphasize they're looking for a delayed birth record. We can also try to help see if there's any kind of delayed birth record. And you don't have to have an application or be charged the $10 fee for that. We'll just check and see if there's a possibility that there is a delayed birth record. Okay, now as for Kentucky death records, this is a typical, again, that's a register, just like you saw with the birth register. You're going to find the name of the deceased, age and sex, whether they were single, married, or widowed, what their occupation was, which can be very interesting, their residence, place of birth, and then the name of parents, or again, in the instance of an enslaved person, the owner's name, place of death, the time of death, and the cause of death. And here is one of those registers from 1852. Again, we do have all of these original registers in the archives, so if you have trouble finding a copy that's legible or that is very readable, we can sometimes bring down those originals for you. And this is after emancipation. This is what a death record would include: name of deceased, color, age, sex, again, whether they were single, married, or widowed, their occupation, date of death and cause of death, place of birth, residence, place of death, and the name of parents and the birthplace of parents. So a lot of information on those death records. And this is, again, another register. And do want to emphasize, these are not complete registers of every person that died in that year in that county, because these were pretty inconsistently kept records. Okay, so if you cannot find this on Family Search, and these registers can also be found on Family Search in some instances for some counties, they've digitized them. But if it's not available, then you can come to us and request it. Just go to that How to Request Records from the Archives page on our website. And if you want to order with a debit or credit card, you can do that by clicking that link, View the KDLA Records Ordering System here. We do charge $10 for in-state residents and $15 for out-of-state residents for these records. And that's considered a research fee because we are getting the microfilm out and looking at the information. You can also send in a form, a PDF, and mail that with a check or money order. And if you do that, the check or money order has to be made out to the Kentucky State Treasurer. Okay, any questions about 1852 to 1910? It's kind of a area where we have a little bit of information. Okay. 1911 to present. This is when we have our first enforced vital statistics law that was enacted by the General Assembly in 1910 and provided for and legalizes the registration of births and deaths. And so here you begin to get very consistent records. In the early years, there might have been a little bit of an issue with compliance, so sometimes people will have trouble finding a birth or death record for an individual when the law first was gearing up. But generally speaking, you're going to find a birth or death record. Current law began in 1911, so there aren't any for 1910 unless the county happened to keep a register. A lot of individuals, really from about 1890 on, probably did apply for one of those delayed birth certificates at some point, especially if they lived past the age when Social Security came into effect. One thing that you should know about birth records is that there is a 100-year waiting period for birth records to be released to the public. So far, Vital Statistics has not released any from 1911 to 1918 because their argument is that someone born in 1911 could still be alive theoretically. That person would be 108 years old, but we certainly have people that have lived up to and past 108 years of age. So they have not released any birth records to the public so far that they have. There is a 50-year waiting period for death records to be released to the public. So you can find death records up through about 1965, death certificates. Birth records from 1911 to the present are only available at the Kentucky Office of Vital Statistics, and they do charge $10. And death records are available from 1967 to present only at the Office of Vital Statistics, and they charge $6 for a death certificate. So Kentucky birth records aren't available to the public, but there is an index on Ancestry.com that covers 1911 to 1999. And to get to that index, you just go to the card catalog. If you have an Ancestry subscription at your library, you can go through card catalog under that search menu, type in Kentucky birth in that title search box, and you see here that birth index. Now they do have some of those I don't know why they say 1847, unless they've gotten some kind of transcribed something from someone's family Bible, but generally 1852 to 1911, they have a few of those. It's harder to find those actually on Ancestry than it is on FamilySearch.org. So. And here's what you're going to find in a 1919 Kentucky death record, for example. They have a lot of information, all that information that you would find in the register, plus you get the undertaker, the funeral home information, the burial and internment information, and an informant who gave the information to the coroner and or the doctor who was making out the death certificate, and then what kind of injury they might have had. And that's an example of a 1919 Kentucky death certificate. Again, these are on Ancestry.com up to 1965. 1966 has been released. We have it on microfilm. Vital Stats is a little slow in getting those records to us. I think we should have up to 1968 by now, but they haven't released 1968 yet. To get to those death records in Ancestry, again, go to that search menu, go to card catalog, and just like with the birth index, type in Kentucky death. And then that's going to bring you here. And you can click on death records to search for the certificates specifically. You can also search a death index that goes up to the year 2000. But again, you're only going to see certificates through 1965. And just one more thing, if you're trying to get a date of death for somebody after 1965 and you can't find them in the Kentucky Death Index, the Social Security Death Index does cover the whole country, and it goes up to 2014. So to get to that index, you can just type in the card catalog Social Security Death, and that will give you that. That's going to give you that index. And I found that to be really helpful for people who are looking for one of those later death dates. Because sometimes people are looking for the death date, they don't have all the information that they need to request the death certificate from Vital Statistics, and this is a good place to go and help them find that information. Especially we've gotten a lot of calls with the new Real ID. People are having to get these dates, marriages, divorces, any kind of name change. Deaths, I think I had a gentleman who called in and was looking for a date of death for an uncle, and it had something to do with the estate. So at any rate, you never know how that can be helpful. And I just want to add, if a person's having trouble finding a birth or death in Kentucky, I always encourage them to check other states if their family lived in a border county. Certainly sometimes a person might have gone to the hospital, like if you lived in Monroe County, you might have gone to the hospital across the border in Tennessee, died there, and then be brought back to Kentucky for burial. The death certificate's going to be issued by Tennessee because the person died in Tennessee. So I always encourage people to check those other states if they're in a border county. That's also really true for marriages, by the way. A lot of people go over the border to get married. Okay. There's the contact information for the Office of Vital Statistics. You can come to their office if somebody is looking for a birth record after 1911. Or one of those death records after 1967, they can come to the Office of Vital Stats in person to request that. They do ask that you get there before 3:30 if you want it processed same day. That's their phone number, and you can also order birth and death records on their website. And this is their website. You just click on birth or death on those links. And here's the information that you have to have for a birth certificate. You have to know the full name at birth of the person for whom this certificate is requested, the month, day, and year of the birth, the county of birth, the mother's maiden name, and the father's name. And for death records, you need the full name of the deceased, the month, day, and year of the death, and the county of death. So that's some of the information that you have to have to give them in order for them to issue a certificate to you. Again, birth certificates are $10 for a copy of that and $6 for a copy of the death certificate. If you don't have Ancestry at your public library, then we do have that here at KDLA, so send your patrons this way. We can check those indexes for them if they're looking for a date of birth or date of death. Okay. Any questions? This kind of ends our webinar. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to switch over now to our housekeeping page here at the end. Just a few things I need to let you know. This webinar was made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You can download the presentation, that box there in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Just click on Vital Stats Kentucky PDF, and that's going to light up that download file button, and you can just download it to your computer. Please take a few minutes here before you leave to take our survey. Click on Kentucky Birth and Death Records webinar, and then you can go to that URL. There is a short 5-question survey. We love to get your feedback about how this webinar could be improved or what types of topics you would like to hear about in the future. So please just take a few minutes to take that survey. Really appreciate your feedback. You will be getting a training certificate for this training that will be emailed to you by the Continuing Education Department here in about a week. It'll also have a link to that survey if you'd rather take it later. And I just want to thank you so much for being here with me this morning, taking time out of your busy morning to talk with us here about Kentucky births and deaths. If you have any questions, Wynn and I will hang around for a few more minutes. And again, this is going to be, this has been recorded, so it will be up on our archived training sessions page where you can access it and listen to it later if you prefer. And again, thanks so much. I hope you all have a great rest of the week. I'm going to go ahead and mute the mic now, but if you want to chat in any questions, feel free to, and we'll be here for a few more minutes. Thanks.